No? A little louder? So there's one small correction. I'm an associate professor. We professors get touchy about that. So the topic of my title is Brahman is closer than you think. And first, I just want to thank our organizers here for putting such a wonderful conference. Am I okay now in the back? Yes?
You just take the microphone to yourself rather than the stand. It would be easier.
No, it's fine. And I want to thank all of our speakers for being here, our indigenous elders, and I want to acknowledge that we are standing on native land. And to all of our revered Swamijis and Swaminiji for coming, traveling so far. There's really, in my opinion, no substitute. We live in a world of globalized knowledge and access to so much information. Yet when it comes to Advaita Vedanta, there's really no substitute for the elders, the sannyasins who hold the tradition and keep the tradition going. Without them, we really wouldn't have a tradition. So I want to especially thank our So let me start with a question. How far away is Brahman? How can liberation, what we often say, the quote-unquote attainment of Brahman, how can we attain this Brahman, this non-duality? What is the process? And when we enter this process, we step into a really vast world of Advaita Vedanta. You come in contact with a set of texts, like the Upanishads, which seem impenetrable. We have a whole world of philosophy, of very deep theory, that is very difficult to understand. We have various practices, religious practices, psychological practices. We're trying to learn, how do we become a better person? How do we gain purity of mind? How do we become ethical, live a clean life? How do we become virtuous? And how do we relate to our community in a way that is clean and smooth and healing? And when we jump into this, we often get lost. And perhaps one of the things that gets difficult right from the outset in Vedanta is that we come across this idea that, well, we have a contradiction, right? Vedanta is talking about non-duality, or oneness of some sort. Yet we don't have that experience. We experience multiplicity. We experience duality. And so the very idea of Vedanta, the final end of Vedanta, of non-duality, is in direct contradiction to all of our perceptual knowledge. And then you start to dig into Vedanta, we come into theories like Maya, we start questioning, what is the reality of the world? Is it truly real? Is it unreal? Is it something in between? Is it neither real nor unreal? And our most common idea, that at least in the popular imagination of what Vedanta is saying, is that the world is illusory in some way, shape, or form. And this seems impossible. And it makes this path, this struggle to attain Brahman even more impossible, at least in our imagination of what we're doing. And we say, maybe when I'm an old person, maybe in my next janma, one of these lifetimes I'll eventually gain moksha, gain liberation. But what Vedanta is saying is the exact opposite. That moksha is right here and now. As our earlier talks have said, Vedanta is not a distant entity. Yet we have this paradox then of trying to attain what seems to be unattained. So how is it close by, is the question. Or is it a distant, mysterious entity? And this is where I find Advaita Vedanta really remarkable. The idea is that there's a pramana, that Vedanta itself, the tradition, coming out of the text, these oral texts, the Upanishads specifically, hold a unique knowledge of what Brahman is, of who we are, what our true self-identity is. And Shankara, the great commentator Adi Shankaracharya, his direct disciples like Sureshvara and Padmapada, and many of the other great acharyas of the tradition have systematized and maintained a very particular way of unfolding the Shastra, of unfolding it in a way to make the knowledge come alive. Without that teaching tradition, this knowledge remains indirect, remains distant, and remains unknowable beyond any kind of this conceptual, theoretical understanding. So I'm going to take one line, one trajectory that we find in the Upanishads and in Shankara and pursue this. And what I want to look at is, we talk about the world and Maya and all that, but what comes before our questions about the world is, what is our experience of the world? Right? Our experience of the world presupposes what we can make claims about the world. But Vedanta wants to go deeper, not ask what is our experience of the world, but what is our experience itself? What is the very nature of our experience? What makes me a living, conscious individual? So this is the question I want to pursue. And to do this, we have in Vedanta a phenomenological inquiry, a method of inquiring into our experience. And this is an unusual thing to inquire about. In fact, I was talking about this last week. Just on Thursday, a student came to my office and she said, "My mind is turning to mush in your class. And she's a third or fourth year university student. She said, and she moved from sciences to the humanities. She said, in my entire academic career, from kindergarten onwards, I've never had to think about myself. You do all this work, but you never actually think about yourself." Even she took psychology courses, but she said, no, we were just talking about what psychology is, but we didn't actually go internal and consider who we are. So one way we do this phenomenological inquiry, is what's called the analysis of the seer and the seen. The drik, drishya, viveka. The drik, the drishya, the seer and the seen, and the viveka, the discrimination between the two. So to do this, what I would ask is, consider your experience. Right here and now, in philosophy, we talk about something called a metacognition, or meta-awareness, or apperception, where you look upon your mind. So if you take a step back and think about your cognitions, your mental states, what we call vrittis in Sanskrit, these mental modifications. Consider your perception of me, your visual perception. Consider the sound of my voice. Consider the feel of your breath entering and exiting your body. The feeling of your seat below you, the floor beneath your feet. Consider the texture of your memories. You can remember what you ate today. You can think about how you feel right now. Happy, satisfied, comfortable. You can think about the future. We have imagination. We have volition. We have moods. We have emotions. We have perceptual objects. And when you think about these, also consider the fact that the moment you have this perception of my voice, for example, it is known to you immediately. There's an immediacy to every one of your cognitions, to every one of your mental states, that when you bring your awareness to it, what we call intentionality, when it becomes an object of my awareness, my mental representations of whatever the world is, it's known to me in that very moment. So there's a knownness and an immediacy underlying every single experience you have, right here, right now, even as I talk, with every word, with every cognition you have. Now, one of the strange things when we think about our cognitions, our thoughts, this is what we call intentionality, is that we're always thinking about the object. Our minds are always going right to the object. And there's a beautiful verse in the Katha Upanishad, which says, Paranchikani Vyatranat Swayambhuhu, the self-existent Lord, Ishvara, pierced our apertures, our sense organs, so they only go outwards. We're always looking out. Our gaze is only designed to go outwards. Tasmat parang pashyati nantaratma. Therefore, we see outwards and not the inner self. And it goes on to say, Kaschid tiraha pratyagadmanam aikshat avrata chakshur amratatvamichan. Some rare wise person desiring amratattvam, desiring immortality, they bring their awareness to their inner self. This is something that we need to learn to do to become a dhira, to become a wise person. How is it that we bring our gaze inwards? Because we have this common refrain that the Atman, the self, Brahman, is in you, is with you, the divine spark, etc., etc. Yet it still seems distant. So we go through a process of discriminating the seer from the seen. So take, for example, a very simple logic. That in a given moment, when you have a perception, like you perceive this podium or this table, an inert object here, and in the very moment that you perceive it, right now, you know that you are not it. I think that's pretty self-evident, but the logic is that subjects and objects within a given moment in a single cognition are fundamentally distinct. Right? So in more technical terminology, we say there's an explanatory gap between the third person, the object, and the first person, the subject. So in all these cognitions, we have the intentional objects, the objectivity aspect, and we have the subjectivity aspect. And so when you look at an object, you know it's not you. You can think of everything that's in between this podium and your body. You can perceive it, whatever those things are. And you can also say, those things, those other individuals are not me. I perceive them, therefore they're not I. But when we get to the body, we get to a very strange situation. Because our awareness pervades up to our fingertips. Yet at the same time, you can take a finger and objectify it. So now there's a question, is this finger you? And the invited answer is no, because I perceive it, I objectify it. In that moment, I am not that finger. And you can do a thought experiment and imagine losing your finger in an accident, and you're still you. Now here we make an important distinction between what we might call a narrative self and a substantial or essential self. So for example, if you are a piano player and you lose your finger, your identity as a pianist is going to change. So your whole narrative, if you imagine your whole life like you're set in a narrative, you're writing your own fictional story or autobiographical story. In that sense, who you are in terms of your self-identity in that long-term picture of your narrative can change. But that subject who's aware of that finger, who still exists, whether it's someone who has a finger or someone who has lost a finger, that I still remains. So where I'm getting at, in brief, where Vedanta goes with this, is that you are not your body. You can perceive everything in your body. And we can do really interesting philosophical experiments, like what if you got hand transplants or organ transplants? You would still be you at some level. The question is, where is that you? Now we can bring this back to the mind, because we might naturally say, especially if you're not an Advaitin, say, yeah, I'm my mind. And all my subjectivities arising from my mind, or from my neurocognitive processes as an epiphenomenon of some sort. But even here we can say, I'm aware of my mind. You're aware of the fact that you perceive me. You're aware of your imagination. Imagine the wind rustling through the leaves outside, or drinking a cup of water. You can say, I am aware of that cognition. You can say, I'm angry right now, or I'm happy. You're aware of those cognitions. So whether it's volition, or imagination, or emotion, perception, inference, what have you, all of these cognitions and mental states are known to whom? Known by whom? This is the question we have to ask. A fundamentally amazing question that for some strange reason in our normal lives we just don't ask. We don't ask what it is. The most familiar thing, the most intimate thing that we have is our own consciousness. But here we have a problem. Because how do I then catch that witnessing awareness, what we call the sakshan, the witness, this presence of witnessing awareness? How do we grasp it? Because Advaita is asking us to know it. But whenever we want to know something, we want to put it in a little box. We want to make it an object that's known. And so perhaps you see that there's a potential contradiction in that process. Because the moment you try and grasp the knower, it becomes the known. Who is the knower in that very moment that you try and grasp it as an object? So let me put this up, maybe kind of make an analogy of this, or act it out. Imagine that this witnessing awareness is like a light bulb, shining, enlivening, illuminating everything on the screen of your mind. And it's as though behind or underneath. And you want to try and turn your gaze and catch it. The moment you turn your gaze and you think you've got it, it's behind you again. The moment you try and create a line separating the knower and the known, the seer and the seen, the moment you think you've done that, both the seer and the seen end up on the side of the known. And that true subject, the witness, is still remaining as a subject. It can never be objectified. In the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, there's a beautiful question by a sage named Ushasta. And he says to Yajnavalkya, explain to me that Brahman, which is immediate and direct, the self that is within all. Yadeva sakshat aparokshat brahma, ya atma sarvantaras tamme vyachakshva. And Yajnavalkya responds, Nadrashter drashtaram pashyehe. You cannot see that which is the witness of vision. Nashrutehe shrotaram shrunuyaha. You can't hear that which is the hearer of hearing. Namater mantara manvita. You can't think that which is the thinker of thought. Navijnater vijnataram vijaniyaha. You cannot know that which is a knower of knowledge. Eshata atma sarvantaraha. This is yourself that is within all. So now we have a bit of a paradox. Because there's two things here. On one hand, this starts to make our consciousness seem like a distant entity. We can't grasp it. How could one know it? Yet at the same time, it's immediate. There's nothing more familiar, more intimate than the fact of our own awareness. you can't deny it. For to deny consciousness, the very act of denying presupposes a conscious agent to do that denial. So we say this consciousness is pre-reflective, and it is a necessary condition for any experience to happen. And it can never be lost. So there's another wonderful verse in Brihadaranyaka where it says, Nahi drashtahu drishter viparilopo vidyate, avinashitvat. Because the vision of the witness can never be lost, because it is indestructible. So now we have a set of intrinsic aspects. I can't really say, to be technical, they're not properties. They are the very nature of consciousness. That it is immediate, immediately known. It is continuous. If you think of the one constant thing in your life, everything has changed. Your body changes day to day, cellularly, on a molecular level. Your narrative self, your sense of identity changes day to day, year to year. But the one constant is this consciousness from which cognition arises and sets, by which all of our experience is unified. It's a strange thing if you think about it, that you have different forms of perception and inference, understanding the non-existence of things, comparing things, the various pramanas we have in Vedanta. And they all come back to you, your imagination, all the states you have somehow get unified in you. It is in this consciousness that unification takes place. So in Advaita, Shankara, specifically in Brihadaranyaka 4.3, there's a discussion of what is the light of the self? What is the self-light, the Swayam Jyoti? And there's a discussion with King Janaka, and he says, Yajnavalkya here again says, when the sun sets, when the moon sets, when the fire is extinguished, when the speech has settled down, no one's talking, what is the light by which a person moves around and functions and returns? And he says it's the light of the self. This light of the self is what we call self-illuminating consciousness. And I want to come back to this point that consciousness is immediately known, but doesn't become an object. This is the most unique thing about consciousness, and is unlike any other phenomenon we have. That it can be a non-object and cannot be known as an object, yet it is the most intimate thing we have. It's always known. With every cognition, you are experiencing, or it is the basis of your experience right now. So they say this is like a sun shining. So imagine your consciousness is like a sun, and it shines and reveals the objects on the ground. At the same time, that sun is revealing itself. We don't need to take a light, a little flashlight here, and try and shine it upon the sun with our limited cognition for it to be known. Similarly, consciousness is self-shining like the sun. It's always available. You can never deny it. It never goes away. So the upshot of all this, the punchline, if I can get to that, is that this consciousness is yourself. This consciousness is the Atman. This consciousness is Brahman. When we say Tattvamasi or Aham Brahmasmi, I am Brahman, it's referring to that consciousness. And it is already attained. This is the most phenomenal thing about Advaita, is that what you seek, you already have. It's like the proverbial person with, this happens to me occasionally, if I have my glasses on and I'm walking around my house searching for my glasses, and my daughter will say, "Daddy, you're being silly, they're on your head." And I go, "Oh, I had them this whole time. There was nothing missing. It's just I didn't know." So to give you one more Upanishad verse, one of my favorites from the Kena Upanishad says, "Pratibodha viditam matam amritatvam hi vindate." Brahman is known, being known with every thought. And by knowing that, one gains immortality. Shankara, in his commentary on this, says something incredibly precise and just profound. He says, "Being the witness of all cognitions, and by nature nothing but the power of consciousness, the self is indicated by the cognitions themselves, in the midst of cognitions as pervading them." This is amazing, because what he's saying is that in every experience you have, every single experience without exception, that consciousness is right with you, manifesting itself. It is available to you. So we have to radically transform the very nature of our spiritual pursuit, of our sadhana as Advaitins. We're not seeking a distant, mysterious entity. We're not studying a bunch of theory that we have to practice, and then we're going to get there. We're trying to recognize an immediate entity right here and now. We don't need to wait for some mystical realization. We don't need to depend upon some kind of nirvikalpa samadhi, like we find in the Yoga Shastra. No, consciousness, Brahman, is right here and now with all of us. So when we say, "I am," that is in fact Atma-jnana. That is knowledge of yourself, is contained in that very experience of I am. Except it's muddled. We have misconstrued the I with the amness. Because that consciousness is not only the epistemological presupposition of all of our cognition, all of our experience, it's also what we call the ontological one. It's the ground of our being. Our very existence is none other than that consciousness. This is our fear of death. It's not about losing the body, it's actually about losing the sense of our existence. We think that our existence will be snuffed out. But we can't even give a location to our consciousness, even though it's immediately available to us. We can't say it's here or there. We can't say how it can be touched by anything like death. So we have partial knowledge. We have this superimposition. We have this misconstrued identity. And this is the power of the tradition. By stepping into the tradition, engaging in sadhana, developing purity of mind, developing proper receptivity to the teachings, engaging these contemplative practices, we have the long, slow, usually pursuit of slowly negating our ignorance, slowly shedding these layers of identity that we're so deeply attached to, until we shed all those layers and we come to a direct recognition of our consciousness, this witnessing presence. So I urge you to consider this drikdrishya viveka, this analysis, this discrimination between the seer and the seen. Make a practice of coming back to your subjective awareness. Advaita sadhana depends on this. It's both the beginning point and the end point. And in between, there's an amazing amount of growth and knowledge to be had simply through that process. And especially when you can do that with the proper guidance of the teacher, of a qualified teacher, unfolding the Shastra in the way it's meant to be. Thank you.